Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise to speak in support of the thrust of Senator Simon's inquiry regarding municipalities in Canada. I'll speak to 5 themes in my remarks, and so that the thread of the remarks will not be lost, particularly not lost to me, I'll announce each theme when I get to it. The 5 themes are identity, history, economic and social influence, autonomy and subsidiarity, and community. You'll be familiar with speakers whose remarks proceed from the sublime to the ridiculous. Today I'll try for the opposite. That is, I will start with the ridiculous and try to proceed to the sublime. Wish me luck. So, identity, 2 stories. In September of 1971, I had taken the train from Saskatoon to Halifax. It was my first day of law school at Dalhousie. I was sitting in the student lounge. Probably my future friend, Senator Wetson, was there, but I didn't know him at the time. Indeed, I knew no one. I was extremely insecure, unsure of myself. Another student walked across the room and introduced himself to me. He said, "Hi, I'm Jim McPherson." I introduced myself, and he then asked, "Where are you from?" I replied, "Moose Jaw." He answered, "I'm from Lunenburg." He continued, "We have a lot of traditions and ways of being in Lunenburg. I'm sure you have many traditions and ways of being in Moose Jaw. But one of the traditions," he said, "one of the traditions we don't have in Lunenburg is that we don't go around with our flies down." I run the risk in telling this story that you will only remember that punchline and in future check whether my fly is down. But I'd like you to remember a different point, at least for today. When it came to identifying ourselves, both Jim and I referenced the town or city we were from, where essentially our identities started. A more serious story. I served for a number of years as the Deputy Minister of Aboriginal Affairs in the Government of Saskatchewan. During the first year in the position, I was invited to make a presentation to the Provincial Cabinet and the Premier. I wanted to make my first point regarding isolation, that is, the 2 solitudes that existed and, in my view, still exist between Indigenous and non-Indigenous communities and people in Saskatchewan, and to communicate something that had bothered me for years. I handed out to each Cabinet Minister and the Premier a Saskatchewan highway map and asked them to locate on the map the town, village really, of Herschel, Saskatchewan. Everyone found it within seconds. It was the home of my then minister, Bernie Weens. It was a village of perhaps 30 people. I then asked them to locate on the map IR 41. There followed much confusion. I gave hints. We eventually got there. IR 41 is the Poundmaker First Nation, a community at that time of 1,041 people with an historic and honorable name in our history. I have a portrait of Chief Poundmaker in my office. But our highway maps dignified this community with a number, not even a name. To the credit of Premier Romano, he immediately pointed to the Minister of Highways and said, "Fix this." He understood that our identities are deeply connected with our communities. We identify with our communities, we take pride in them. Our communities matter, their health and prosperity matter, today more than ever. History. In 1867, Canada was a predominantly rural country. Nearly 85% of Canadians lived in rural areas. Ottawa was a town of 18,000. Our biggest city, Montreal, had a population of 107,000. Toronto, 56,000. In case you're wondering, Moose Jaw in 1867 had a population of 0. It didn't then exist. Towns and cities were not unimportant in 1867, but they were not what they are today. It's not surprising, therefore, when the British North America Act was written, civic leaders were not at the table, and matters of local concern were assigned not to these relatively insignificant towns and cities, but to provinces, and as we have seen, only too clearly in recent court cases, towns and cities, essentially the creation of provinces, cities even as large as Toronto, are sometimes left to the whims of provincial inclination. Today, we see a complete reversal of that picture. Residents of urban areas now make up over 80% of the Canadian population, a percentage that has been rising almost uninterrupted for decades. The town of Ottawa, that 18,000-person town, is now home to 1,017,000 people. Toronto's population, that 56,000 place, is now 2.794 million people. The city of Moose Jaw, I'm sure you're anxious to know, is the home of 33,655 wonderful people. Economic and social influence. Our towns and cities are nothing like the communities of 1867. They are much larger, more dynamic, more central to our culture, more engaged in the delivery of services to our citizens, and urban centres are now, more than ever, engines of our economy. There are a few highlights to emphasize the point. The city of Saskatoon operates the largest bus service in Saskatchewan. The budget of the City of Toronto is $13.53 billion. In Toronto, there are over 800,000 businesses. It is home, Toronto, to 38% of Canada's business headquarters and a $364 billion economy, which represents 20% of Canada's GDP. Remarkable as that seems, urban Canada continues to grow and prosper despite its modest status constitutionally as creatures of the provinces, an historical curiosity of 155 years standing. But as we hear from civic leaders and from the Federation of Canadian Municipalities on a regular basis, it is a challenge for them. For example, the revenue backbone of our municipalities is property taxes. They account for between 32% and 60% of municipal revenue, depending on the city and province. It often feels to me as though the two key revenue sources for my city of Saskatoon are property taxes and parking tickets. Sadly, I contribute to each. More seriously, we need to take these issues seriously in a principled and long-term way. One of the governing principles in the establishment of our country, I think I didn't announce this title about subsidiarity. Already lost my place, and I apologize. One of the governing principles in the establishment of our country was that of subsidiarity. That is, or was, that functions which are performed effectively by subordinate or local organizations, here I invite you to think towns or cities, belong more properly to them than to the dominant central organization, here I invite you to think provincial or federal government. This was the central basis upon which, in the assignment of powers in the Canadian Constitution, matters of a so-called local or private nature were assigned to the so-called subordinate organization at that time, the provinces, but not towns or cities. When one thinks about the present, however, if we are to design a governance regime of our country on the basis, among others, of a principle of subsidiarity, we would be likely to provide much greater responsibility and autonomy to urban governments. Now, we're not going to rewrite the Constitution to restructure the modern reality through constitutional means, but there are other ways. Many have reflected on how this might be done. I don't have a magic bullet answer, but it must be based on a recognition and partnerships on the part of the federal and provincial governments to achieve organized, structural, stable modernization of the legal and governance authorities for towns and cities, and the stable long-term access to fiscal resources to enable our cities to deliver so many government services critical to our citizens. This should include long-term fiscal framework agreements, not so much piecemeal, but long-term fiscal agreements. It should include structured access to new revenue sources. It could include new authorities for our cities. Let me give you one example, one that we discussed at the Agriculture and Forestry Committee a short while ago with Mayor Braun of the City of Abbotsford. I served for a few years as Saskatchewan's Deputy Minister of Municipal Affairs. As I mentioned these different positions, you're thinking, this is a guy who couldn't hold a job. You might be right. Anyway, in my first year there, we rewrote the Cities Act of Saskatchewan to give cities the status and authority within limits of, quote, natural persons. essentially turning the grant of governing authority upside down. Rather than granting only specific powers, the Cities Act gave urban municipalities in Saskatchewan sweeping authority except where specifically limited in the legislation. There are many other ideas out there to strengthen and vitalize our cities from wiser commentators than me. My last point is about community. All of these ideas and many other possibilities are proffered to strengthen our communities, and how important that is for us, for our communities, and for our country cannot be overstated. I am reminded here of remarks delivered in a slightly different context by my friend John White, but which I think are relevant to this important conversation, particularly in terms of what governments can and must do together to build our society and our country. Mr. White once said, more eloquently than I could ever do, and I quote, "A nation is built when the communities that comprise it make commitments to it, when they forego choices and opportunities on behalf of a nation, when the communities that comprise it make compromises, when they offer each other guarantees, when they make transfers, and perhaps more pointedly, when they receive from others the benefits of national solidarity. The threads of 1,000 acts of accommodation are the fabric of a nation." Let me say simply in conclusion that we at all levels of government owe to our municipalities acts of accommodation, acts that benefit us all and, woven together, comprise the fabric of a wonderful nation. Thank you. Merci.
Beautiful.